From import to export, orientation for Nigerians regarding recent policies by government, closure of land border in Nigeria and the economy, and also the huge appetite of Nigerians for foreign goods. We have always been inundated with the campaign or social mobilization on Think Nigeria, Eat Nigeria, Consume Nigeria, and Speak Nigeria. That will be the focus of the discussion segment on Insight today. And my guest is Ajuri Ngelale. Ajuri Ngelale is the Senior Special Assistant to the President on Public Affairs. Good to have you on Insight.
Thank you for having me.
You look Nigerian.
I am Nigerian.
Imagine you came on set with some foreign outfit. How will you feel discussing this issue?
Well, fortunately for me, in my daily life, I pretty much live in Nigerian attire. It's something that I feel very natural in wearing, from Baba Riga to normal kaftan to my South attire from Ogoniland, where I hail from. So I don't really discriminate. The main thing is that Nigerian attire is what I find to be most fitting and most comfortable for me as I go about my daily activities, both on screen and off screen.
Before we go into the other aspect, let's discuss the mindset and the attitude of Nigerians towards consuming and using Nigerian products.
You know, the challenge we've always had, Omini, is that, there's always been this perception. And I think it goes back to the colonial era, this kind of legacy mentality that was left behind, that what is outside is better and what is here is somehow less or somehow substandard. And I think that that misconception and that concept has led us to a point where we have almost become boastful of those things that are outside. If we send our child to university in the UK or Australia, we boast and say, I sent my child to UK or Australia. Or if we drink an imported wine, we will tell our friend, oh, look, this is the imported one from Switzerland. We're very proud about it. I think ultimately, the reality is that there are some things that you must import that are not yet produced locally. That's an accepted reality. The key is, how do we now progress out of that? How do we make sure that those things that we're not, that we're currently importing, that we can produce them locally? That is the focus of the president. But those things where we're already producing locally and we're just working very hard to find what we can, consume from abroad, that's where I think we need to make some significant cuts. And I think if you look at government policy in recent years, you would find a very concerted and determined effort on the part of the administration of President Muhammadu Buhari to ensure that we are patronizing our local firms. Just look at Innocent Motors. Go to the immigration service. You're going to see Innocent Motors all over the place. Across MDAs, you're seeing the patronage of Innocent Motors, for example, instead of Toyota, increasingly. Obviously, there's still more to be done in terms of increasing the market share, increasing production, but it's clearly a sign that we're moving in that direction. And I think Nigerians gradually are beginning to follow that lead, because even if you look in the stores, people are now saying, look, there's a bag of chips, for example, and it says made in Nigeria, and they're telling their friends, look, this is a fantastic, very high quality, and it's made in Nigeria. Same thing with rice in the markets. Nigerians are increasingly becoming proud to patronize locally produced goods, and I think that's encouraging.
Okay, let's look at it from the other angle. The problem has been that some Nigerians will tell you, I don't like Nigerian products because in terms of quality, in terms of content, in terms of finishing, do you have something to say maybe to the entrepreneurs, to the manufacturers who are into this?
Well, I think
looking at the perspective of competitiveness.
Sure. Well, there are two sides of that coin, right? You have, on the one hand, quality assurance within organizations, whether you're a car manufacturer, a textile manufacturer, or even a university, a private university, for example, to ensure that both private and public university, to ensure that we have effective world-class standards. On the other side of the coin, you also have the role of government in terms of regulation and ensuring that we ensure that certain basic minimum standards are never impinged upon or never reduced beneath. And I think that's a joint responsibility, but I think increasingly there's an awareness within Nigeria that as we're beginning to see the uptick in local manufacturing across sectors, across value chains, whether it's agric, whether it's pharmaceuticals, toys, people are seeing that there's competition now. You know, it used to be a situation where you have low manufacturing, low local production. You're now competing essentially with those brands that are abroad that are imported. But now, with the uptick in what we're seeing, the more we have competition within our local producers, the more market forces will determine that their quality is increased so that they can increase their own market share. It becomes in their interest. It becomes their interest to ensure that happens. But clearly, standards organizations of Nigeria, the FCC, PC, NAFDAC, and others obviously are undertaking that responsibility to ensure that we do on the side of regulation what is necessary to increase standards of our products.
Okay. Usually when government takes a position in terms of policy, in terms of a policy direction, like it is with the closure of land border, now the immediate impact is normally a bit harsh, but after a while, it stabilizes and relaxes naturally. How do you just oppose this policy, the economy, and the consumption of Nigeria by Nigerians?
Very important issue. I mean, you know, this has been an area where there's been so much misinformation and misconception around the issue of the border closure and what it means for the ordinary Nigerian. Let's just be very clear about what the facts are. We have seen verifiable and tangible results since the border closure, one of which is that we had a daily PMS consumption, subsidized PMS, imported PMS consumption rate at about 61 million liters per day that had now dropped after 1 month of the border closure with the Benin Republic on the western border to 50 million liters per day. Meaning that over 11 million liters per day times 30, you're talking about 300 million liters of subsidized PMS that we've been paying for and not benefiting from. That's on the one end. So you're talking of tens of millions of dollars in savings there in just 1 month. On the other side of it, we saw in September that the customs reported a new revenue generation in the month of September of 115 billion naira, the highest they have seen since the inception of this administration, and I believe it's the highest ever recorded. These are the kinds of things that tell you the kinds of give you a sense of the economic damage that's been done through the intrusion into our markets of these illegal items, whether pharmaceuticals, technological, or food items, et cetera, et cetera. Now, with that said, I think what's very clear now is those importers are now having to take a second look, knowing that this option is now closed to them, and the negotiations between the Nigerian government and border countries, not just Benin Republic and Niger, but also Ghana and some of the other West African countries. Once those negotiations are done, they're going to realize that the only way they're going to penetrate this market and save costs is by building production facilities within Nigeria to supply the market in a legal fashion, paying their taxes and paying their duties. So these are some of some of the outcomes that we're going to see. I also would just quickly touch on this. Mr. President has been very, very adamant about the need for us to make that transition, which is always a difficult transition internationally, from being a consumption-based import economy to a production-based export economy. We are in the middle of that right now. In fact, from 2015, our manufacturing percent to GDP, manufacturing contribution to GDP was negative 4.2%. Negative 4.2. So it was actually reducing. People were leaving the country. In 2018, we were at positive 2.1%, which means that you have a swing of about 6% contribution of manufacturing to GDP over the course of the first 3 years of this administration. And we have just seen the CBN report this last month that showed that we are now on our 31st consecutive month of growth in the Manufacturing Purchasing Managers Index, which basically records the inflow of manufacturing and production facilities within Nigeria. So clearly, government efforts are on course, and we're very excited for what this will mean for not just job creation, but local production, so that we can continue to ramp up our exports for the benefit of our people.
Let's speak to our brothers and those foreign nationals who somehow try to truncate this policy, the smugglers. Some people try to justify them. Why should they be justified?
There's no justification. Anybody who attempts to justify any grounds on which an illegal smuggler will be smuggling goods illegally into Nigeria is essentially defending criminality. I don't know anybody with good conscience that can come out into the public domain and defend criminality. I think what we have heard are some claims about, the effect that the border closure is having on the prices of some items. Some people are saying there are some parts of the country where rice has ticked up a little bit, where we're seeing a bit of impact in that regard. This is what's very clear. For us to close our land borders, which we have done, what that now means is that those illegally smuggled items that have saturated our markets are now just overnight cut. What that now means is that the market supply, very temporarily, that supply in the market, there's now a bit of a vacuum. What that now means is that there is an increased demand on our local producers, whether it's rice, whether it's wheat, whether it's maize, you name it, name the item. But the challenge we have is that the current producers are used to a certain level of demand. Now, demand overnight has shot up, has skyrocketed. So now they have to make adjustments. It's good for them because now they have more demand so that they can try and meet that supply. But it's also stressful in the sense that they've been producing at a certain quantity, and now overnight they need to quickly ramp up production. It's a good thing, but it's also a challenge. And I think in this interim period where we're in this kind of awkward middle place where we're trying to meet, our local producers are trying to meet the new level of skyrocketed demand, there's a bit of challenge in terms of doing that. In the process, what we're now doing is doing legal imports of goods where there's a fallout. So for example, in rice, if our local producers can only produce, say, 80% of our local demand, then you have a 20% gap, right, that may have been filled before by illegal smugglers. So what we're now saying is that 20% gap, until our local producers can fill that gap, we are going to import legally whatever amount of commodity we need across sectors to fill that gap so that our local producers aren't overly stressed and we keep prices at a stable price point within our markets.
But as much as we still have pockets of criticism on the policy, you can't rule out opposition in a democracy.
Right.
That adds to the beauty of it. Mm-hmm. What attitude should Nigerians generally be putting up now?
Well, I think naturally...
Is just to vilify government? No, yes.
Right, well, this is what I say. When you look at, a lot of times during the campaigns, and even if you listen to radio and watch television, you hear people talk about China. China used to be an impoverished, agro-based country, a very small economy with a huge population. How did they manage to take hundreds of millions, 700 million people out of poverty in 30 years? We look at their results, we look at their achievements, we don't look at their process. What they had to do, for example, was to ensure that they cut out imports by industrializing their country, by taking the bit of grains that they had, selling those grains to, for example, Russia. Russia would now bring in their engineers, and they would now teach the Chinese how to build their industries, and they would use the little bit of grain that they had at the detriment and struggle of ordinary Chinese citizens, millions of whom actually died in the process, to bring in Russian steel, for example, to start their industries. Then they started producing steel, the Chinese. Then they started being able to build their industries, and now they've been able to bring out all of these people from poverty. Now, in Nigeria, we're not doing the same thing the same way, but we're doing the same thing in terms of we are using industrialization and diversification away from oil and gas into agriculture, into manufacturing, into production, into industry in such a way that we can achieve the same result. But we have to be honest with our people and to say that it's not going to be easy. Whenever you're building something that's meaningful, that's long-lasting, there is a bit of struggle involved. There's a bit of toil involved. But then everybody reaps the benefit. Let me be very particular on what I'm talking about. President Muhammadu Buhari is personally supervising a program called Made in Nigeria for Export. It's Project Mine. That's what we call it, M-I-N-E. And essentially what that entails, and he's personally...
Made in Nigeria for Nigeria?
Yes, Made in Nigeria for Export, okay. Project Mine. And President Muhammadu Buhari is supervising that project directly. It is his own personal project. He's very committed to it, and it's very personal to him. There are three different economic zones to start out, special economic zones, SEZ, that we're starting out with. One is in the east, which is the Enyimba Economic City in Aba, right, across 3 local governments, including Ukwa West, where you have very high gas deposits, etc. Already on behalf of the Enyimba Economic City, SEZ, we already have an MOU in place, a $2.5 billion MOU with the Ruyi Group, which is a Chinese textile manufacturer, one of their largest. They're going to supply uninterrupted power supply to the Enyimba Economic City, in addition to developing industries within that zone. So it's not just on paper, like we've heard in the past. You have actual contract agreements already signed, and we already have the investors in place to take advantage of these zones. In the north, we have the Funtua cotton cluster that's going to be sited in Funtua in Katsina State, which is a hub for cotton production. That's where we're going to site textile mills and textile production and textile and cotton farms, etc., to ensure that we have the supply that meets the demand. And to that effect, we've already signed an MOU of $200 million that was going to create 700,000 jobs with the Danish textile manufacturer Vlisco. Vlisco is well known across the continent. They've already signed that deal with us to supply, to build capacity in factories within that Funtua cotton cluster. On the other side, on the west, we also have the Lekki Industrial Park, which is the 3rd special economic zone under Project Mine, which is really going to focus in on core industries that are competitive, that can take advantage of the locational advantage that Lagos provides. So you have all of this in place. Already we've already put aside 14 billion naira in the 2020 budget just to get all of the basic engineering frameworks in place. But in addition to that, the major bulk of the funding, it's only 25% owned by government. 75% is going to be owned by multilateral agencies like the African Development Bank, like the Afrexim Bank, and other multilateral agencies, in addition to our private investors that have already signed MOUs with us. We expect that we are going to increase manufacturing percentage to GDP from the current rate of approximately 4% to get to about 20% manufacturing contribution to GDP by 2025. That is 6 years from now. We believe that not only are we going to accomplish that, but we're also going to accomplish in hard monetary terms about $30 billion annual export contribution to our GDP as well by 2025. So this is, Project Mine is very central to that process of moving from import to export. And that's not even including what's going on in agro processing and some of the other very critical sectors.
Is there anything government could do, or the regulatory agencies, the enforcing agencies could do to also kind of speed up what government is trying to correct? You still go to malls, you go to big shops, boutiques, and you still find a lot of foreign goods. How did they get there?
Well, no, we have to be very careful, we don't want to antagonize retail stores that are importing their goods legally. Because we do have legal importation, and we want to emphasize to our people that this is not about antagonizing people or creating enemies within the trade space. We believe in free trade. We do not believe in illegal smuggling or illicit trade. And so if you go into a store, for example, and they have a whole bunch of imported Gucci and Versace and all these other brands and imported wine and all that, that's well within their rights, so long as they have imported it legally, so long as they have paid the right customs and duties to our customs, and we've gotten our revenue out of it, they're more than free. The main thing is, wherever we can ensure that we can create the production capacity to ensure that what is previously imported is now produced locally, then you've now opened up the space to demonopolize, number one, and then also to ensure that they have adequate competition, and then prices can come down. Imagine, for example, if Hennessy, for example, had a production outfit in Lagos or across anywhere in Nigeria, for example. These are the issues, and I think we have to address, first of all, the superstructure, the issues of reliable power supply, the issues of port reforms, the issues of the road construction that we're seeing around the country, rail construction around the country. These are the kinds of kind of superstructure or core infrastructure that's required to bring down the cost of production, to encourage more industries to move into the country so that we can do a bit more in local production as opposed to raw importation.
Well, let's look at the traders now. A few days ago, I had a chat with the president of National Association of Nigerian Traders, and he went into a kind of orientation for them to have a change of mind if you have smugglers in your midst, expose them. What's your take in this direction?
There's no doubt about the fact that that is absolutely necessary. This is a joint task. Governance is not for government alone. Governance is for the people who have the actual power, because ultimately they had the power to install whoever is in government through the electoral process. So it is a joint task. And I think for us, we've already been very clear. We just launched the ICPC toll-free line that has to do with all forms of corrupt practices, to be able to have that access to immediately, on demand, call in corruption wherever we see it, whether it's in smuggling, whether it's in fraud within offices, private or public, and that's 0800 call ICPC, 0800 call ICPC. So that's available on that regard, not to speak
of... Toll-free?
It's toll-free. It's a toll-free line. And obviously you have the usual process as well, where you can petition the EFCC and the ICPC, etc. But we have that new toll-free line to make it even easier for our people. Let me just say this very quickly, Omeni. When you look at the entire scope of what's happening in the country, and when we talk about the orientation of our people toward production instead of consumption, a big part of that is the fight against corruption. Because let's be honest, when there's free money, the natural propensity of a human being is that if they receive free money, they'll feel very free to spend it. But if you work very hard and you've sweated and you've toiled for the money that you have, you'll be very aware of how you spend that money, no matter how big or no matter how small. And that's what President Muhammadu Buhari understands. And that's why from 2009 to 2019, 10 years, we, all of our, the EFCC, total cash collection in terms of asset recovery in cash was approximately 1.28 trillion naira in 10 years. Out of that 1.28 trillion naira, in the last 4 years, from 2015 to 2019, 73% of that total was accumulated, was recovered under this administration. In hard monetary terms, that's about 939 billion naira out of 1.28 trillion naira. That was done in the last 4 years, as opposed to the 27% that was done in the previous 6 years. So that speaks to the strength and efficiency of the anti-corruption fight under President Muhammadu Buhari, and ultimately that's relevant here, because if we're able to cut down on the kinds of inefficiencies and the kinds of corruption we've seen, then Nigerians are going to be much more committed to ensuring that the monies they earn legitimately are spent very wisely and are spent on those things that they can afford, and hopefully that will be to encourage our local producers by patronizing locally made goods.
Thank you so much, Ajuri Ngelale, SSA to the President on Public Affairs. It was nice having you on Inside today.
It's been a great pleasure. God bless you.
Up next on Inside is the interview segment. Don't go away.